Welcome, Doug.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start from the beginning. Let's start with us, the home front. What's going on in the United States now, and how does public opinion and the general understanding that the public and the elites may or may not have about international affairs, how does that prepare the United States to be a player internationally?
I think this is probably the most important question that is so seldom raised. It's certainly not understood overseas when you begin to try to answer it. So I think we should spend a few minutes on this. The first thing to understand is if you go to the Pew Research site and you look at polling data going back many, many years, decades in fact, there's very, very little evidence that Americans are enthusiastic in any way about the use of American military power beyond the borders of the United States. In other words, if you start looking at what people thought in 1914, in 1940, in 1960, 1970, 80, 90, and even now, the majority of respondents do not like the idea of American military power being engaged overseas as a general principle. They would prefer that we not be engaged militarily, specifically in conflict. There's another issue that doesn't come up, though, that has to be borne in mind, and that is that most people on any given day are really not interested in what happens beyond the borders of the United States. Now, this is good news for the elites in Washington and New York City and places like that, because there's very little attention devoted to what happens overseas, which means decisions can be made without necessarily consulting the American people that might otherwise be rejected. So that's the bad news. But the good news is that Americans really don't want to meddle in other people's affairs. And I think your listeners, particularly those overseas, should be very happy to hear that, because it's true.
Unfortunately, the image that we convey is exactly the opposite,
Absolutely.
right? That we are this overpowering, bully, starting wars at the drop of a hat. And people can list everything, Vietnam and this and that, and interventions in Central America, whatever that is. And then, of course, closer to our times, of course, Afghanistan and Iraq, where you were part of that, right?
Sure.
In your own professional experience. And then now we talk, we're going to go to war with Iran. Is it going to be another war here? Are we going to go to war with North Korea? Are we going to go to war with China? All these things are popping up at the drop of the hat.
Well,
what do you say?
I think what's changed in recent years is, first of all, that we are almost 75 years from the end of the Second World War. And there is very little tolerance anymore in the population at this particular point in time for conflict overseas, for embroiling us in conflict overseas. And most important, that means casualties.
Yes.
American losses overseas. And it's very difficult to explain to the American electorate why we would be interested in fighting with Iran or fighting with China or fighting with Pakistan or anybody that you can point to right now. The average American looks and says, well, all right, perhaps they're not, quote unquote, everything they should be. But why are we involved? And I think this is something that President Trump, as a candidate, clearly understood. I think he still understands it. The interesting part is he lives in the center of Washington, D.C., surrounded inside the White House and in his administration and on the Hill by thousands of people who are desperate to keep us committed overseas everywhere. And there are two reasons for that. Number one, they really, truly see the United States as the center of the world. I think President Trump loves the United States. I love the United States, but we realize the United States is one of many great powers. We have interests in many places, but we don't necessarily have an interest everywhere in everything. It is actually possible to sit here and say, well, if country X and country Y want to fight with each other, ultimately that's their business. If we can help mediate or bring it to a close, we're happy to help, but we really don't want to be involved. It's kind of interesting that 75 years after the Second World War, this mentality is creeping in, whether the elites inside Washington like it or not, into the daily dialogue.
Explain to us, how did we get into Afghanistan and later on, and it's much worse, I guess, Iraq in 2003. Of course, we know 9/11, we know Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan, and all, but lead us into this, because most people say, What happened? It's been 18 years,
Right.
and we're still there, and we are not winning. And what's the matter? And what is so vital in terms of American interests
Absolutely.
to continue this thing?
I'll give you a quick example, and this is something that people really ought to do who are interested in understanding the answer to your question. Go back and look at the orders as they were explicitly written, the military orders, to senior officers in 1991, in 2001, and then subsequently in 2003. And in each of those, there are very specific mission orders that say, you're going to go into Kuwait
and
into southern part of Iraq to eliminate the Iraqi military presence in that country, and specifically to find and destroy the Republican Guard. That was 1991. That was it.
Yeah.
That's all.
That was a limited, circumscribed
Absolutely.
objective.
We didn't do it. We didn't eliminate the Republican Guard. Most of it escaped. That's another issue. But the point is, if you read that, there's nothing in that about we're going to cross the Euphrates River, occupy Iraq, and transform it into a liberal democracy. Absolutely, totally absent. You go to 2001, we were supposed to go into Afghanistan explicitly to kill or capture Osama bin Laden, his inner circle, and perhaps 500 to 800 people that were fighters up there associated with this Al-Qaeda entity. That was all. There was nothing in there about make war on the Taliban, which was completely separate, distinct from Al-Qaeda. But unfortunately, we didn't do something that the British, who were very successful imperialists, always did. We didn't practice economy of enemies. And so we have the president making statements along the lines of, you're either with us or you're against us, when in fact, truthfully, most people on any given day are neutral. They're not necessarily involved. And the idea that you could provide, say, several bags of gold to the Taliban, who would then willingly turn these people over to you to be rid of them, simply was dismissed out of hand. And so you then go in to do one thing, and then somebody says, well, we really have an obligation to stay here.
Which obligation?
Why? Well, we have to help the Afghans become a modern state. Who are the Afghans? Which ones? The Uzbeks, the Tajiks, the Hazara, the Pashtun? I mean, help us out here so we understand who these people are. Again, sort of like Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's a region, not a nation per se. Well, then we'll turn it into a nation, and they'll all learn to live together and so forth. So you go in for one reason, which, by the way, we failed. We did not kill or capture Osama bin Laden. And we should have relieved the four-star who was in charge, because he had billion-dollar assets, the National Security Agency, the CIA, Special Operations Command, and failed miserably. We don't. He's not held accountable. In fact, it looks as though people were happy that this then became a reason to stay there, even though everyone with knowledge of the region said, whatever you do, you don't want to stay in these places. You'll become a magnet for hostility, hatred, corruption, and so forth. So then you fast forward to 2003. We're going to go in to eliminate the Saddam Hussein regime, preferably to capture or kill him and his inner circle. And that was about it.
And turn it over to the Iraqis in London and all that
stuff. And the expectation was that we would, in fact, not dismantle the Iraqi army, armed forces, police, and administration. But then you realize the generals arrived there after 2 weeks. They move into palatial settings where they feel very important and like conquerors, which was exactly the wrong thing. And then suddenly they do nothing, and Baghdad descends into chaos. And a decision is made here in the Oval Office with Dr. Wolfowitz and Vice President Cheney along the lines of, Mr. President, Iraq is even weaker than we thought. We have the opportunity to create from the ground up the first liberal democracy in the Middle East that will be friendly to Israel. Only someone who is smoking crack on a routine basis would ever reach such a conclusion, but unfortunately, the answer was, yeah, great, let's do it. And so we end up, once again, descending into madness. We end up in a war with people who were never the enemy, who had nothing to do with 9/11. Al-Qaeda, that had no foothold in the country, thanks to Saddam Hussein and his secular regime, gains one. We obliterate the Sunni Muslim population, which had historically controlled it, in favor of the Shiites. In the meantime, thousands of Iranian agents go into the country who've been studying it for years, cultivate support, and voila, by 2011, Iraq is effectively aligned with Iran. Our position is untenable, and Thankfully, at that point, we left. Of course, then the argument is, well, you see, you left and so you got ISIS. No, we created the foundation for ISIS long before we left. And that then was simply taken advantage of by other actors in the region, and the rest is history. How do you deal with this? The only thing that you can do under the circumstances is what President Trump has been trying to do for the last 2 years. Leave. End it. Get out. You can't fix it. You can't transform it. And your very presence is part of the problem, not the solution. And then figure out who is your partner in the region and who is not. Try to work with your partners and try to cultivate new ones, instead of looking at a country like Iran as this permanently hostile entity whose regime absolutely must change, even though we have a long, long history of experience with sanctions that tells us that sanctions do not change regimes. Sanctions make populations miserable, but sanctions don't put new governments in. And by the way, how do you rebel against a government when you have perfect gun control in Iran and the rest of these countries where the entire population is disarmed? So it's absurd nonsense. All you're doing is making large numbers of people miserable. So it might be useful at this point, I would say, when we talk about sanctions regimes, again, sanctions against Russia, sanctions against everyone in sight, to back away from the assumption that these things are necessarily inducing change in behavior when they don't.
But the argument, of course, that if we go back to the Bush administration and even those inside now the Trump administration who are pushing for, no, let's stay a little longer, let's do this, because the idea, if we leave, these places will become a staging ground for something really bad that's going to hurt us. What do you say to that argument?
Well, first of all, we don't have much evidence that these countries are going to become the staging grounds for something bad to hurt us unless we insist on open borders and uncontrolled immigration. If we go back to 9/11, first of all, the people that committed the 9/11 atrocity came here under false pretenses. They pretended to be students under student visas. They obviously weren't. Very few people tracked them. Then they became illegal because they stayed beyond the limits of the visa. So now they're illegal, in addition to having come under false pretenses, and they're still not being effectively tracked. And they could move back and forth across the borders at will. They planned most of what they did in Hamburg, Germany, not in Afghanistan, which is not a particularly good place to plan much of anything except getting out. And then they planned the rest of it here in the United States. So the lesson of 9/11 is your first act, instead of invading another country, is close security. Your borders.
Yes.
Find out who's in the country. Get control of who's here. We didn't do that. And here we are, 19 or 18 years later, we still haven't. And we're worrying about what somebody in the vast reaches of the Hindu Kush might do. That's absurd.
But the philosophy, again, I think you summarized it earlier, but I think for the benefit of our audience, I think it's important to point this out. The philosophy at the time of the Bush administration and the people who were surrounding the president, you mentioned Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld and Cheney and all these people, said, no, in order to be safe in the United States, we need democracy everywhere, right? We need to spread the good seeds of democracy because, and that's theoretically true, democracies are peaceful.
Colonel Douglas MacGregor, thank you for coming on, sharing your insight, your wisdom. We value you. We appreciate your service to our country, and thank you for coming on today.